This is Duke University.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much to our student leaders as well. Those of you who are alumni know that it's really the students that are running this show. And so we want to give special thanks to Mahesh and Megan for running the whole conference, and special thanks to Rhonda for putting together this panel. So, and thanks to all the student leaders involved in the conference. And of course, thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. We have a lot to talk about. I hope we get through some fraction of the questions that I have. I'm just going to very briefly introduce our panelists, and then they're certainly welcome to tell us more about themselves. And then I'd like for them to talk about some of the challenges of bringing a product to market. That's the first question. That should take a while, I think. We heard a little bit about some of the challenges associated with the FDA a few minutes ago. Feel free to complain as much as you like about the FDA, because Chris already checked to make sure there aren't any FDA people in the room. And then we'll talk about what you do around products. And then we'll follow up on, Kaizad had a question in the last session about emerging markets. And so if we have some time, we should talk about the differences between the richer markets and the more emerging markets. But first of all, introductions. Paul Reid, Executive Director of Marketing at Merck. Paul and I were reminiscing about what this place looked like just a few years ago when it was just the East Building and the West Building. Tom Keller was the dean. So Paul is a distinguished graduate of our program, and how we've since layered on all these buildings and made the thing kind of a maze. I want to also introduce Thane Weddick, Vice President of Marketing for Global Diabetes Brands at Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly, of course, a dear friend and partner for the Fuqua School. And Rob Lawrence, who is also a graduate of our program, a very recent graduate. It feels to me like it's recent. I guess it's recent, but reasonably recent.
It's all relative.
It's all relative. So this is pre-Breeden Hall. I don't know how the Fox Center fits into.
Second year.
Oh, okay.
So we actually got to enjoy the fruits of all the construction my first year.
Okay. Okay. Good. And Rob also worked with Paul at one point at Merck, and now is founder and president of Salient Research and Consulting. So want to start off by just asking you about some of the challenges associated with bringing a product for obesity to the market, and how those challenges might be different from other products. So we can do some contrasting with devices and pharma, but I especially want to talk about obesity versus other products. Is it tougher to get a product to market for obesity than, say, for another class of disease? And what do you do about that? What are the strategies associated with that? Would you start us off, Paul?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I should mention that I'm a Fuqua grad from 1988, so he was referring to East and West Wing, so I think most of the construction happened way after that. So in any case, so a couple of thoughts around the area of obesity in terms of products. I think the first thing is Jeff Moe in his introductory speech last night, which many of you probably saw, actually said that one of the key things is there's only one product on the market, because a lot of products have actually gotten removed over the last couple of years for a lot of different reasons. So I think that speaks very much to the challenge. So even when products make it to the market, they can't actually stay in the market because they find out about side effects later on and so forth. So I think that's probably one of the challenges, and I'm not an expert scientifically, so I'll just have to preface that. But I do think that the obesity area is probably one of those multifaceted areas, meaning that there's a lot of, it's not as simple as maybe hypertension where you're just lowering hypertension. There's a lot of different factors that come into play when you try to treat the area of obesity. So I think there's a lot of other effects that it can have, and that's another reason I think from a scientific perspective why it's been so difficult to bring something forward to the market.
Thank you, Paul.
Just to follow on what Paul had said, type 2 diabetes is a fairly well understood disease state, even though the needs are clearly not being met the way that we would all like to have them met. But it's really about insulin deficiency, beta cell dysfunction, insulin resistance, at the area of the liver, the pancreas, and the peripheral tissue, the muscle. That's very well understood. Obesity, from a discovery research and a target perspective, is not very well understood. There's a CNS component, there's a metabolic component, and to try to come up with a druggable target has proven to be incredibly difficult. And that's why there has been literally billions of dollars spent on trying to discover molecules and then bring those molecules through development at a time when the regulatory pathway for obesity it has not been completely clear, although it is much clearer today, but then the safety hurdle has risen to an extent that because in many respects there isn't a division at the FDA that is specifically dedicated or devoted to obesity, and the fact that in many cases obesity really isn't seen as a distinct medical condition, the hurdle rate for safety in order to get a drug approved is incredibly high. And so you have to have effectiveness, you have to have safety, and those two together working on a target that is multifaceted has proven to be incredibly difficult. We've been in the discovery area for obesity for probably 15 years, and we've advanced a couple of compounds to as far as phase 2 research, but we've never gotten a compound into phase 3 research. But we continue to try because we know that the need is clearly there, and if we can get a very safe and very effective product to market, the commercial potential is enormous.
Yeah, I think I'll echo what Paul and Thane said. I think it is an extraordinarily complex disease. I mean, and the neuropsychiatric pathways in which you can actually activate. Obviously, I think the FDA has an increased concern on safety, but and you look at rimonabant as a really good example of another product that was approved in the EU but subsequently removed because of neuropsychiatric side effects. So I think the desire to find something that works, that's efficacious, that provides enough efficacy, but also without causing any deleterious side effects or adverse experiences is very, very difficult. And the FDA obviously is very, very protective of their perceptions and obviously their role in the drug approval process at this point. So the disease is very, very complex, but it's also one, at the end of the day, that patients can eat through. And so finding something that works, patients, for patients that have dyslipidemia, you can lower their cholesterol. It's a pretty direct relationship. For patients that have hypertension, you can lower their blood pressure. For patients that are obese, you can't necessarily stop them from eating. And so in addition to that, there's also a behavioral component that ultimately leads to not only the efficacy from a physiologic perspective, but also from a patient behavioral perspective. It's just a challenging space to get a product that works and then to get it approved ultimately and maintained on the market.
Very challenging, tough to get on the market, but a great reward potentially, as Thane pointed out. Can you talk to us, if we do get a product to market, and it is a great challenge, but Chris said in the previous session that a device is not going to be a silver bullet, and Rob talked about eating through this problem. So the treatment, albeit wonderful, will not solve all the problems. What do you need to do around the product? What do you need to do around that treatment? Let's go in reverse order. Rob, would you start us off?
Yeah, I think my panel colleagues would probably agree that a pill or an injection alone isn't going to solve or fix obesity or even it will only be a helping factor. At the end of the day, behavior modification, changing habits is really a critical component of managing your own weight and addressing the obesity epidemic. So I think in addition to developing a safe and efficacious treatment, there's also the need to pair that with a program or resources that give patients the ability to help change some of the eating habits or some of the behaviors or some of the environmental conditions even that also lead to obesity. And so I think moving forward, it's not just a pill or an injection, but it's also a variety and an interlinked series of resources that helps the patient not only take the medication, but also make other environmental changes that would lead to a more healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, I think that was really well said, that we have, across our diabetes portfolio, we know that in order to achieve an improved outcome for an individual patient, which is our main goal, that it's going to require a very effective and safe medicine, but also other things that you wrap around that medicine. I can't speak to what it would take in obesity because we haven't had the fortune of getting a product to market. What I can talk about is, especially given the relationship between type 2 diabetes and obesity, what we attempt to do on the type 2 diabetes front And this is a program that we talked about over lunch that Merck has helped create in the United States and that Lilly has also helped to foster outside the United States. And it's really built upon the premise of how adults learn. And without learning, you can't expect to get behavior change. And we have a collaboration, OUS, as Merck does in the United States, with a company called Healthy Eye, which is predicated on a series of peer interactions that a person with type 2 diabetes would have with other individuals with type 2 diabetes around what's called a conversation map, which, for lack of a better word, is a large display that then leads to a very interactive discussion that's facilitated by somebody who is expert in the disease of diabetes that happens to be on a particular topic associated with the disease itself. It could be about different medications that are used to treat the disease. It could be about how to make a healthy lifestyle or dietary choices, whatever it might be. And it's a component that we think is really important to, again, wrap around the medicine so that you can get a more engaged patient population. You can help them learn more about their disease and what it takes to achieve a better outcome with their disease, and continue to foster learning and education, because without that learning and without that education, there really isn't going to be an impetus for behavior change.
And Thane, at lunch you mentioned perhaps some success with healthy interventions that you've been able to identify.
Yeah, so I know that Merck, again, they've been running with the program in the U.S. for about a year longer than we have outside the U.S., and they've implemented some trials that Paul and Rob can probably speak to better than I can. But you hear first anecdotally, and then as we start to put into place some controlled clinical trials to understand the degree of understanding the disease all the way to the degree of glycemic control. And you clearly see it move in the positive direction just by education and learning in a peer setting using just the principles of adult learning, as opposed to here's a pamphlet that you can take with you as you leave the physician's office, or here's a website you can go to in a very kind of one-dimensional way, attempt to learn more about your disease. So I don't know if Paul or Rob, you can.
Go ahead, Paul.
So actually, so I don't work in the diabetes area, so I won't be able to give as many specifics on that. But I think probably to your point is one of the key things that we're in diabetes and other areas we're very interested in is just the whole aspect of patient education, because there's only so much the physician can do, and it really, and they're also challenged because every patient is different, right? They see 10 different types of patients in terms of whether it's obesity or diabetes, and there's different ways to kind of manage them. So the more patient education, the more intervention things we can give them, the better. So I think that's kind of what I'll say about that. But in terms of in answering the question, I guess the one thing I think is pretty neat is and I don't mean neat, I guess, in a positive way, but people saw the study last week that it came out, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, about how the current rate of obesity in the United States is 32%, right? And I think it's projected to go up to 42% by 2050. And if I remember correctly, it was somewhere in the range of 15 to 20% only like 25 years ago. So, I mean, if you look at that dramatic of an increase, right, in the rates of obesity in the United States, clearly there's a lot of things that need to be done with respect to lifestyle, right? So to Rob's point, it can't just be about a treatment. It's not that simple, really, right? So, and the other thing, and I don't know all the stats across all the developed world, but there's pretty stark differences in terms of if you compare the U.S. to other developed nations, and there's some that are on the one end of the spectrum and some that are on the other end of the spectrum. So it says that there's some nations, whether it's from a lifestyle perspective, whether it's from the incentives that are in the system, whatever it is, or just maybe it's from culture, that there's differences in terms of the rates of obesity, the rates of level of exercise, the types of diet. And so I think long term, I mean, it's just so complex. I mean, I think it has to be, the government probably needs to get involved. You think about employers need to get involved in terms of encouraging these healthy behaviors. You think about schools probably need to get very involved. And I mean, both elementary schools as well as colleges. I mean, just there's so many different players in the system that can help encourage, I guess, a better lifestyle and a better way of living and just exercising as well. So it's not just going to be about the medication or devices. It's really going to be about changing that overall lifestyle, because that trend of 32% to 42%, it's kind of one of those things that, the statistics don't lie. It's going to happen unless we do something to stop it, right? So that's kind of a huge challenge, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, if I could sort of take that point, I think as we've been talking about all today, this is such a complex problem, and there's so many stakeholders that are involved in it, yet change often happens one person at a time, and it's one behavior, one decision that somebody makes not to eat the Twinkie diet or whatever it is. But people make individual decisions and make small steps to make that. to go back, because I don't want to leave the point around the conversation maps, is one of the things that was really, two things that I think were really impactful about that. One was it created a sense of a social accountability. When you have adults sitting around a table having a conversation and having an open dialogue about, well, this is the choice that I make, and this is my struggle, and having an open exchange, it creates a sort of sense of not only individual accountability but group accountability. And there's something really powerful about that as we think about some of the solutions here. The other thing that was interesting is that it was totally not tied to product. And I mean, you can talk about this in ex-US as well. I mean, this was something that was done with no connection to Merck's diabetes franchise or Lilly's diabetes franchise ex-US. And the intent here, with at least from Merck's perspective at the time when I was there, was to help, just to provide more tools that could help patients, at the end of the day. And I think the positive results that we were seeing with that, and I think that Thane spoke to, they're real. So the change comes maybe, as complex as the system is, it often comes one person at a time, one decision at a time, and we can't lose sight of that in all the complexity. So.
Just one last comment is it's because of the strong linkage between obesity and type 2 diabetes. Diabetes is a chronic disease, but it's also a progressive disease that doesn't just get to a certain state and stay there, but it continues to progress as the individual becomes either more insulin resistant or their beta cell dysfunction becomes more severe. And then the associated complications that go along with that, we all know about the kidneys, the eyes, the cardiovascular system, and the nerves. So how do the challenge is how do you get people more engaged in understanding what the potential consequences can be if they don't do a better job of taking care of themselves? And so one of the things that we have done over the past couple of years is invested externally with a group to try to understand what kind of impact that could be made in more of a peer setting and not necessarily facilitated by a healthcare professional like we have with the Conversation Map project. But the premise is that in the U.S., for instance, there are, let's say, 20 million people who have diabetes. One of our physicians, who was the leader of our discovery research group, before he came to Lilly, was in the clinical setting. And so he said that there was probably about 1% of his patients who, when they came in to see him, knew more about diabetes than he did because they were so engaged with the disease and they understood what they needed to do to achieve a better outcome for themselves. And his premise is if there are 1% of these individuals who can then go and, in essence, help other people, the other 99%, do a better job of understanding their disease and what it takes to create a better outcome for themselves, just think of the power or the multiplication effect that could create. So if you've got 20 million people with type 2 with diabetes, 1% of 20 million is you'd have 200,000 people out there who, in a peer setting, could kind of create this social hub or this social network, if you would, and actually progress a good number of people toward a better understanding of their disease and hopefully better behaviors associated with that disease. So we're in the midst of trying to prove that model right now, and hopefully within the next couple of years we'll have some pretty strong evidence that something like that not only works, but it's also possible, and you would have a captivated and engaged audience who would raise their hand to say, I want to be part of that 1%, and then the other group would also raise their hand to say, I want to be led by that 1%, because I know that I need to understand this disease better than I understand it today to achieve a better outcome for myself.
One of the challenges, just to kind of roll on that, one of the challenges I think is that diabetes and the side effects and the sequelae of diabetes are well known. When patients are diagnosed with diabetes, and we've done a lot of market research in this space and talked to a lot of patients and physicians, there's a couple of responses that happen. Number one, some of them shut down. Others of them kind of accept it, and they're not quite sure what to do. And then there's some that are truly shocked about their behavior and shocked about the condition, and really from that moment on, fundamentally try to change their lives. And I don't think we're at that space with obesity yet. I don't think patients are scared of obesity. I don't think they're aware of the side effects. They're way too far down the road. We talked about immediate gratification earlier on in the day, and again, you don't see the consequences of those choices until farther downstream. And so again, as we think about all the support network and again, how Pharma can help support it, one of the ways is to really raise the awareness around what obesity actually is as a medical condition and what the opportunities are to treat it, to educate not only patients and consumers who may be obese, but also physicians who treat it, and to really dig into what are the opportunities to avoid these downstream consequences like type 2 diabetes, which I just don't know if in Topeka, Kansas, if the average physician and the average patient, the average obese person really has an understanding of the downstream implications yet. I don't think we're there yet as a culture. And clearly within the medical part of the culture, there's just not the linkage from one to the other.
Absolutely agree. So obesity has a different guard as far as a disease or a disease state. I want to keep on the point of what we do around the product, about how we raise awareness and work with patients. And you talked about healthy interventions, and you said it's not that Merck and Eli Lilly both are doing, and that it's not tied directly to product. How do you make the business case when it's not tied directly to product? So at a time when Merck and Eli Lilly are facing cuts and facing all sorts of pressure, something needs to be cut. Well, is this helping us with our sales? Is this helping with or at least patient compliance?
Yeah, it's really tough to make an ROI case for investing what literally is, I'm sure on the Merck side as well, millions of dollars in a patient education program or initiative, and expecting then to get the resultant impact on your insulin sales or your Januvia or Janumet sales. What you have to have is belief internally that in order to achieve a better outcome for the individual patient, it's going to take more than just the medicine itself, and that's what patients need, and that's what providers and payers expect. And so for this particular program, we didn't do an ROI analysis. We had a small kind of contingent of believers internally who felt that we needed to have a signature program outside the United States that we would attach to Lilly in our diabetes efforts, that we wouldn't attach to the product, and that by doing so, we would create not only interventions or initiatives that would help a patient and help the caregiver and be, in essence, appreciated by the payer, would also have then the downstream impact of enhancing the Lilly Diabetes corporate brand equity, which we know then is important as it relates to choices that people make.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what Thane said about ROI. I think when Merck was considering this, we had no idea whether what we do. I don't think we ever calculated an ROI or had any idea what the ultimate impact was. But I think that increasing the trust, increasing the value that's perceived by customers, be they prescribers, allied health professionals, or ultimately the patients and consumers that take the medications that are produced, is really critical for the entire pharmaceutical industry right now. Pharma's under pressure from a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different constituents, and so real investments, not necessarily tied to, maybe they're tied to brands, but maybe they're not, but ultimately things that really increase trust and value in what's kind of an embattled industry right now, I think is really important. And so sometimes it's ROIs, it's you can't make those assessments, but you know that there is a good investment for the long-term trust and value of the organization.
Thank you.
So I'll comment on that. So I think I like to look at it simplistically, like at a overall company level. I think there's what I'll say both short-term and long-term investments, and there's branded and unbranded investments, right? So in the short term, certainly there's a significant amount of investment that you're going to make in your products for that next year, right? There's also probably a significant investment kind of in the research side that you're making in that therapeutic category for 5 years or more out. And then there's also, and it's not a small amount, it's usually a pretty significant amount that's in the short term for the general, greater, greater, benefit of the overall disease category or across several different disease categories. And there's also kind of what I'll call, corporate campaigns and initiatives that are very, unrelated to products. And, one area that I guess is an example of being related to products very generally is adherence. So adherence is a big area of interest. It's an area that a lot of companies I know make a lot of investment in. It's an area that they've done so for many, many years. There's not any necessarily magic formula in that area, but it's still an area that is really for the greater good. And I think there's a lot of examples of that. So I think when you get down to the budgeting level, there are obviously some very difficult discussions, I'm sure, but I think for the most part, each of those areas gets a significant investment, I'm sure, from most companies. So.
Good. I have more questions, but I really think I should probably go to the audience, and I hope I'll squeeze those questions in. But I see Eric with the microphone ready for anyone in the audience who has questions. I know we have a lot of expertise on this subject in the room.
Thank you. This whole notion of research for the greater good is an interesting concept. And you might help me understand a question I've had. You might be aware that a lot of so-called bariatric medicine physicians prescribe a lot of medication for obesity management. Their drug of first choice is phentermine, which was never approved for long-term use. And I understand they use it long-term, and they use it in higher doses than it was ever promoted to be used in. And they claim that, indeed, it's okay. But I've assumed that nobody really with deep pockets would study this because there was no financial gain to be realized by finding out that, in fact, phentermine could be used effectively and safely. It's been off patent for a long time, so who would benefit except perhaps the greater good? You guys thought about studying that?
No. Lily, we literally spend all of our efforts trying to come up with additional innovation. Not to say that the products in the market aren't important or perhaps can't be studied to find additional uses, but we devote all of our efforts to trying to understand where are there continued unmet needs and how can we target potential molecules or targets against those unmet needs and then bring that forward. There's clearly a commercial rationale for that, but it's also based upon the premise that we're going to go after diseases where there are continued high unmet needs and see if we can come up with innovation that is valued by the payer, the healthcare provider, and benefits the patient in the end. But the short answer to your question is no.
So I've done a fair amount of market research in the obesity space, and we've talked to some of those physicians who are either bariatric physicians or they just run weight loss clinics and they prescribe a lot of phentermine. So I think that behavior is out there. I think that it does work for them. Most of them have a very tight system of patient management. They will only give out 1 month prescription at a time. They ask the patient to come back in to get their weight checked and to have their hypertension checked, basically to have sort of a regular panel done to make sure that they're still in control and that none of their other cardiovascular parameters are moving in ways that would signal a warning sign. It works for them, and in terms of the greater good investment, I'm an industry consultant, so I can't, I think it's an interesting question, but I do think that there is still, I think there's still a huge unmet need for something that works better than phentermine, and other targets that are promising should continue to be pushed forward.
May I ask a follow-on question? Probably the most effective thing we've seen pharmacologically for obesity management was phentermine, fenfluramine combo. Do you think if it were not a drug for obesity, there's a possibility that the drug might have been allowed, that the combo would have been allowed to continue going forward with some sort of monitoring safeguards?
I don't really know anything about the specifics of that one. I mean, I'm familiar with the product, but I don't really know the specifics around the safety stuff.
My opinion would be 10 years ago, yes. Today, no. I just think that the safety hurdle and the sensitivity around product safety is so high at the FDA that I'd have to say today it would be no.
If you look at the FDA's actions around the advisory committee actions around QNEXA, and I can't remember the other component of QNEXA, I apologize, but basically I think one of the components was, basically they're both generic components that have been around. Both would be off-label for weight loss, but both have been known to demonstrate weight loss consistently. I think in today's FDA, I think the answer is definitely no, based on what we've seen with recent FDA actions. 10 years ago, maybe could have been a very different situation, but whether that would remain on the market today, given what happened with Meridia, I think, again, is kind of doubtful. As discussed, the FDA doesn't think this is a condition. I mean, that's part of the problem from the drug perspective is there isn't really a foundation, either an established regulatory foundation really to move forward with this. I mean, I think they have parameters they're looking for, but until they have a real obesity panel and are really looking at this from the medical benefit perspective, it's going to be difficult.
As we know, there's 10% of the population in states they have diabetes, and we do have the technology and the medication to help them. But there's also another maybe more than 20% of population have prediabetes. And is there any innovative medication solution for the primary prevention?
Yeah, so the question is around proving a drug that can actually prevent diabetes for somebody who's in the pre-diabetes state. There actually have been studies with a couple of different medicines that have shown that. The FDA doesn't have a clear pathway for what it would take to get approval for a drug that would actually prevent diabetes for somebody who has this metabolic condition or this state of pre-diabetes based upon a fasting blood glucose level or some sort of a glucose tolerance test abnormality. And so I think it's yet to be proven. There also is then questions. There are questions around the payer's willingness to pay for medicines to treat a precondition as opposed to a condition that has already been made overt. So, it's a tough question. It's a tough subject. Clearly, the need is there. The patient population is far larger than the patient population with diagnosed type 2 diabetes. It's a pathway that just doesn't have a clear regulatory road. So it's a very good question, though.
I'm full of pessimism too, but I want to be more optimistic. So all the things that we just lined out as far as metabolic syndrome, and if you add C-reactive protein, inflammatory condition, and you also add the fibrinogen characteristic, I mean, you've got clear diagnostic measures. You've got a clear population that is moving into danger, and you've got products. So I'm always skeptical when we're just doing something for the public good. I mean, I clearly agree that there has to be some advantage. So I don't understand why there isn't more of an effort by any one of the companies that are effective in that space of saying we want more awareness of metabolic syndrome. We've got a remedy to take one of the five, and in some cases you would find companies that have multiple products that would play in that space. I don't see a barrier there in the sense of that it's in my self-interest to make more people aware of metabolic syndrome, and thank you very much, we have a remedy to help you with that. Why am I not hearing that instead of kind of the public good argument, but just there's a clear product play here? I don't understand why there aren't more efforts focused specifically mimicking, say, cholesterol levels.
I think Acomplia, Sanofi Aventis, rimonabant, the CB1 antagonist, tried that, and that was they had a very large disease awareness pre-launch campaign around metabolic syndrome, and the e-cannabinoid receptors, which have been explored and have been in development from a number of different companies, have glucose effects, have weight loss effects, have lipid effects. I mean, they are kind of a jack of all trades. And unfortunately, they got approved in Europe, but were subsequently withdrawn due to psychiatric side effects and didn't get approved in the US, and subsequently other companies have discontinued their program. So I think that there have been at least attempts to do that. Unfortunately, there just haven't been products that have followed on to really fully execute and provide a solution for it. I don't know, I'd be interested in
in a lot of the research that we're doing within our internal organization, I think we recognize that if you're just trying to lower blood glucose, there are very good drugs out there that can do that very effectively. And so what we have moved toward is what we would call kind of a glucose plus profile, so products that not only lower blood glucose in a meaningful way, but that also would have effects on weight, on the cardiovascular outcomes, on lipids, on blood pressure. And so if we were able to synthesize a molecule like that actually in preclinical or early clinical models could show those benefits, then I think that there would be a tremendous market opportunity to test those, not only in the overt diabetic population, but also in these individuals with prediabetes. We just haven't hit that target yet. Now, we do have a drug in collaboration with Amylin called Byetta, which is the only drug on the market today to treat type 2 diabetes that actually for a segment of the patient population provides meaningful weight loss in addition to having a pretty robust effect on blood glucose. The challenge is it's a twice-a-day injection. And so then when you start to talk to regulators and you start to do the business case internally about how likely would it be to get somebody to inject themselves twice a day in a pre-diabetes state, you then go out and you talk to patients who have this pre-diabetes condition and they say, well, once I get diagnosed, can't I take a pill for that? And the answer absolutely is yes, you can take several pills until you ultimately have to inject yourself. You quickly then learn that patients are not real willing to inject themselves a couple of times a day if there are alternatives. And so it's a conundrum that is based upon patient preference, based upon alternative choices. And it's something that if we could have an oral form of Byetta that lowers blood glucose and drops weight and then has a corresponding impact on lipids and blood pressure, boy, that's a home run. We just haven't hit it yet.
Ask our friend Danny Bolognese from Trimeris about the problem of daily injections. HIV/AIDS patients fail at a 70% rate on a daily injection to save their lives. So I suspect that just losing weight, you're hardly going to get me to do that.
Yeah, you'll get a segment of the population, but it's a really small segment who are very, very motivated to do it.
Yeah, hey, can I comment on Jeff's question too? So I've worked a lot more in the cholesterol category, so I mean I think it offers a good analogy in a couple of ways. So cholesterol was I guess an emerging topic back in the 1970s, right? And then there started to be more and more products that were made available for cholesterol. So there was a lot of things that needed to happen in order for us to get to the place where we are now with respect to kind of how aggressive we are in treating high cholesterol. So it started out with a set of guidelines that were, much higher LDL and total cholesterol levels back 30 years ago. Those guidelines have moved over time. And then as new products get introduced to the market, and then as there's been a lot of landmark clinical trials really, that led to new indications, which of course is what we're bound by. All those things needed to happen over quite a long period of time before you got to the point where we're treating what I'll call kind of a lower level of patients with a lower baseline cholesterol level than we did 30 years ago. So it just takes some time, and I think it probably has analogies in other markets as well. So I think you have to do the studies, you have to then get the indications for the products, and I think to your point, it would be hard to think about how many people would actually be willing to kind of take the treatment if they're kind of on the margin, or if they're not really that sick, I'll say, because even if you look at because when we look at cholesterol, even the people that are in the, let's say, the most severe category, even their treatment rates aren't anywhere close to 100%, right? So so it's kind of do you focus as a health company, but also from a physician perspective, do you focus on getting from a 50% treatment rate to 100% treatment rate in the most severe, or do you focus on kind of the less severe areas? And I mean, they're both important, but it just takes time, and you have to kind of move down that spectrum, basically. And I think it has very similar analogies, I'm sure, to diabetes and obesity. So.
I mean, the fasting blood glucose level that previously defined overt diabetes has been lowered. Probably not, it's been lowered once, I think, in the last probably 15 years. It could probably, based upon what we know now about the prediabetes condition, be lowered again. Because there's absolute evidence that says once a person hits a certain fasting blood glucose level, that they're going to continue to see that blood glucose level rise over time to the point where they do become diagnosed with diabetes.
Paul, your discussion of cholesterol reminded me of some of the over-the-counter versus prescription products. So, for example, Merck made a real effort to go over-the-counter with Mevacor. So then you'd have Mevacor over-the-counter, you'd have a prescription Zocor and Vytorin. Yep. And also I think about in the obesity space, I think about Xenical being the prescription product and Ally being over-the-counter product. The panel talk a little bit about whether you're going for prescription products, over-the-counter products, and how your strategies might differ in those spaces.
I mean, that's a tough
I caught you off guard with
that
one.
I hadn't thought about it, yeah. So I mean, I think for people that are aware, so there's many statins on the market, right? So about 10 years ago, or maybe even longer ago, Mevacor, which is what I'll call a more moderate efficacy statin, so it doesn't have the same types of reductions in LDL as some of the more powerful statins. And so it was thought that you could actually provide Mevacor at a lower dose, have patients actually take it themselves. and it would be manageable, right? But also statins do have some very important side effects that, in the past typically needed to be managed by physicians. So there was kind of this back and forth, and in the end, we never really got to a point where anybody was comfortable with this being an over-the-counter product. So that was the Mevacor situation. I think it probably has similarities, though, to almost any other category, which is you have to think about, I think what you have to think about is how easy is it for a patient to, number one, they have to recognize that they have that issue, right? So, it's not like, I'll say over-the-counter cold remedies where I know that I have a cold and I therefore go to the pharmacy and I can get that. So I have to have had, let's say a blood test for cholesterol. I have to, and I can do that without even going, I need to get the cholesterol results, but then I can go actually make my own decision without even going to the doctor. So I think it's a whole, confluence of, what's the role of the physician? Can the patient make their own decisions? What happens if there's side effects, and do you give them really clear direction as to what to do when there's side effects? And so I think in a lot of these cardiovascular categories, it's probably more difficult than it is in some of the, colds is just one example, but there's a lot of examples of categories where it might be a little bit more simpler decision.
Yeah, obesity is kind of an interesting, if you kind of take it back to obesity, it's kind of an interesting space, right? So, right, cholesterol, you have to have a blood test. You have to know that you have high cholesterol, so you sort of have to be in the physician's office. Obesity, you have to be aware, you have to recognize that you're obese, which a lot of patients who are overweight don't recognize. Really, truly don't recognize just that they are clinically obese. And so I think there's some interesting sort of consumer behaviors and just issues that are specific to obesity that would make this kind of hard. Ultimately, you have to have motivated consumers and motivated physicians. So to prescribe something, at the end of the day, you have to have a motivated physician who believes that this is something they want to treat, but also a motivated patient who's willing to take it, willing to try it, and willing to to hopefully try diet and exercise and other other lifestyle behavior changes along with it. On the OTC side, you just have to have a motivated consumer, but they don't have either the safety net or the accountability of being in a physician's office, and so it's interesting. I don't know if there's an answer to the question, but
Can I add something to that, David? So the other thing I was thinking about is, so if I ask the audience, how many of you have seen a commercial for some kind of weight loss medication in the last week? On TV, whatever? No? Not too many. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3. Okay, but so there's so many of these commercials, that are like fat burning, whatever, or miracle pill. There's a lot of things on TV, and maybe you're not the audience for receiving those particular commercials by the audience response, but there's a lot of those types of commercials. So if you think about a new medication that's actually let's say from a pharmaceutical company that's maybe approved by the FDA and so forth, versus the other, let's say 90% of things that are unproven remedies or things that people don't, so that I guess the consumer doesn't know what to trust in terms of what the right medication is, and that's part of the issue too, because there are really a lot of commercials out there for things that aren't necessarily proven or regulated, and I think that's part of the issue too in this particular space.
Agreed. I have a couple more questions, but let me go to the audience. You have a microphone, perfect.
Hi. I have a question, and correct me if I'm wrong in this logic, but your pharmaceutical companies come up with a product, a medication, that isn't a silver bullet necessarily, but it helps a substantial percentage of the population. So in order to increase the number of patients you actually help and the effectiveness of your product, you decide that your company needs to invest in some amount of research in aiding doctors, physicians in helping patients manage their lifestyle habits, maybe changing their culture, their eating habits. And then these devices come along like the VLM, virtual lifestyle management, and other monitoring devices like phone apps. Do you find that the tools that you create to help make your medication more productive or efficient, do you find that to be threatening at all to the sales, the number of sales of your product? And what would you do in the case that a VLM or a phone app would actually work? And do you find that there's room for profitability in prevention? Could you find a way as a pharmaceutical company to stay relevant like Xerox has during the digital age? Can you change from paper, providing paper, to services and still remain a successful business?
That's an excellent question. I'll give you the diabetes perspective. I think obesity is a little bit different where, perhaps there isn't as much of an underlying, metabolic condition as much as there might be more of a behavioral or environmental condition that can be perhaps mitigated by some of the technology you spoke about. But we talked a little bit about wrapping services and education and support around the medicine because we think those two go hand in hand, and you're not going to get the full benefit of the medicine unless you do provide some additional ancillary support and information to help better educate the individual with a particular disease to do a better job. My guess is, as students, you can probably go online at any one point in time and see what your grades are in any particular class. Is that a fair assessment? I know my children in middle school and high school, as parents, we can go online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and know exactly what their grade is in any particular class and know what their score is on any particular activity. And so there's some inspection that is involved with helping to hopefully not chastise the child, but to motivate the child. You saw the heat maps for obesity and diabetes that were shown, I think, by a couple of different presenters. So picture yourself in the Sun Belt, and you're an average patient with type 2 diabetes being treated by the average physician. Chances are that if you're lucky, you spend face-to-face with your healthcare provider on average an hour a year. Let's say 10 minutes every other month, which is fantasy land. In reality, it's really more like probably 10 minutes a couple times a year. So you're on your own 364 days and 23 hours. You're on your own to take care of this disease. When you walk out of the physician's office, what do you carry out with you? You might have some information in your head that's been told to you. You might have an educational pamphlet. You might have a prescription to get refilled. You may have a website that you can go to. But chances are you don't have anything much more than when you walked in that office. Think about the premise of some sort of a health scorecard that can be facilitated with online activities to what you talked about, mobile technologies that would say, here's my blood glucose reading, here's how it compares to the last time I had that blood glucose level checked. Is it green, is it red, is it yellow, or is it red? Same thing with BMI, same thing with lipids, same thing with blood pressure. And whatever the important stats are, here's the last time you had your eye exam, here's the last time you had your feet checked. For the average person in the average primary care setting, that doesn't take place. And so in my mind, I think there's a great business opportunity, but more importantly, I think there's an incredible social health opportunity and an individual patient opportunity to just do something as simple as that, to raise the level of understanding and education of an individual person with a disease using the technology that we have available to us today that we have not even begun to scratch the surface of. So if anybody wants to come up with some seed money, I'll sign on and try to make that happen. But I think it's a very deep question. I think it's an outstanding question. We don't see technology displacing drugs. We think that those two have to go hand in hand and be very complementary to, in essence, get a better outcome for that patient that we all strive to achieve.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I agree. It's a really, really good question. I think the way I look at it, though, is that there's way more than just the medication that we as a pharmaceutical company sell, right? So we've always sold, information, clinical studies, all that type of things as part of our value proposition. As we've moved forward, we also add to it information technology. I mentioned before patient education, so there's all kinds of patient education materials and programs that we have. So I think it keeps on adding. And so the way I look at that from a competitive perspective, though, is if I have two companies and one company offers, basically just the medication and maybe a few things around it, and another company offers the medication plus some terrific program with all kinds of great solutions and interventions, that makes it so much easier to your point, Thane, around communicating with the patient and giving them, which one am I going to be more likely to prescribe, and as a patient, which one would I more likely to be, which medication and program would I more likely to want to be part of? And so that's kind of how I look at it from a competitive perspective.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd say that's a little bit different is I think because obesity is driven by differing lifestyle, differing choices, different environmental factors, I kind of put it back into a consumer segmentation model. There are somebody can develop the killer app, and that's great. Maybe it works for 80%. Maybe it works for 20%. Who knows, right? But there's going to be another segment that it isn't going to work for, and another segment that isn't going to, and so there's always going to be the need for something else, especially in this space because it is so behavioral based and so individualized based on families, friends, networks, jobs, and all the other things we've talked about. So I think it'd be great if, as solutions continue to become available, and I also think pharma is probably going to continue to look for partnerships to help augment their own products.
Good. Well, thank you so much, panelists. I believe we're out of time, or do we have time for one more? I look to the students because they're the ones that are really running everything. One more? Okay, good. One more question, and a quick question and a quick answer, if we could.
I don't know how quick this is. Okay, the question is do we as a society, are we willing to pay the money that it takes to actually prevent obesity? So the diabetes prevention program was performed. It was number needed to treat somewhere between 10 and 20, depending on the intervention, to prevent one case of diabetes. The intervention was a medically trained person, 1 hour visit, first weekly, then monthly, then quarterly for 4 years. At my institution, two I was at during that time period, Dallas, they got free admission to the Cooper Clinic. At Vanderbilt, they got free admission for 4 years to the Diani Health Science, the health center. And that was done for 4 years, and they prevented diabetes. Can we do that in 50 million people? And do we really think that a virtual computer program can repeat those results?
David, would you like to take this one?
Well, I mean, I'll just start it, and then I'll start with the easy part, and then you guys can take the difficult part, I guess. Thanks. So I mean, I guess the way I look at it, though, is there have been diseases where the problem's been recognized. We have put forth this whole society has put forth the effort to kind of either control or even eradicate the disease, and it's been seen as a major priority. So I guess it has to hit the very top priorities, and I'm just thinking of like some of the things that vaccines, like polio and smallpox, that's kind of one where it's pretty easy to recognize. And so I think people recognize that would have had huge, or even I guess did have huge health consequences, big consequences in terms of costs in the medical system, and so they recognize that one early. And I think you just have to get the same recognition has to occur in other diseases like diabetes and obesity in order for that to be also one of the absolute number one priorities. But it's not an easy answer for sure.
The only thing I would add is, given the process you described and the intensive nature of that and the associated cost and clearly the number needed to treat being way higher than I think any of us are comfortable with, if we can understand how to get that number lower. So instead of a number needed to treat of 20, we get a number needed to treat of 5, and it becomes a lot more cost effective, and you can perhaps kind of embed or institutionalize using technology that process much more so than the very human intensive way to do it, then I think there's great application for it, but not with the results that we saw with that prevention program. It's just there's no way you can justify the cost associated with that result that was achieved.
We'll make our keynote speaker finish that answer, I think, maybe. Right? Okay, good. So thanks so much, panelists.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.